We're going to come on to our third speaker of the evening, and he's always a popular speaker.
In the 30th year of World War III.
Oh, in the 30th year of World War III. Yeah. I knew I'd get there in the end. Thank you. Mike Newland, ladies and gentlemen.
Why is there so little resistance to the destruction of Western societies? Well, this has perplexed people for decades in our movement. Why the public so passive? Well, last time I spoke here, I talked about the situation inside Western countries, including this country, and the question I asked was, do people in the street don't understand what's going on in a sort of pithy everyday, in a pithy sort of way? They don't have time. Most people don't have time to study politics and read all the ins and outs in the way that obsessives like us do. And it just perplexes them. Why do the government do the things they do? Maybe they don't understand what's going on, stuff like that. Are they just making a lot of mistakes? No, they're not. But to get the public motivated, you need to give them aha moments where they say, my goodness, I didn't understand all that, and just in one phrase, I've suddenly understood it. Yeah? And good political communicators are very good at doing that. Farage is extremely good at that, giving people aha moments. So I was trying to devise a way that we could give people an aha moment about what's happening inside Britain with the government. And the answer I gave was, and it's actually quite simple, that because of the passivity of the population about politics, they've largely withdrawn from the political fray, don't belong to parties anymore, that the worst elements have taken over politics. They're actually pathological, the people in government. They hate their own people. They've actually got a pathological streak. Some of them are actually psychopaths. That doesn't mean everybody in government is a psychopath. The point is that once you have a system set up and people's careers depend on remaining within that system and towing the line, a lot of people who are perfectly normal will become pathologised themselves, and the whole regime can become pathological. And the regime in this country is pathological. It's trying to destroy its own people, isn't it? Yeah? It's as simple as that. You don't need any really complicated, sophisticated political understanding once you grasp that. So today I want to address something a different way. How can we have an aha moment about what's been happening internationally in the last 30 years? People need this nutshell framework, and radicals are so obsessed with politics, they're generally not very good at putting over things in a way which are folksy and understandable to non-politicals. For example, we've been talking about immigration for years. What we should have been talking about is population replacement. Immigration's a different thing. You could argue about that. Are you racist if you don't want immigrants coming in? That's a question. You can argue about that one. But we don't have immigration. We have population replacement. My goodness, you can see that in London, can't you?
Yeah,
the population's being replaced wholesale.
Yeah.
So you need people to understand things in a simple way. So I want to address what's happening internationally. Now, in 2015, the Greeks foresaw they were going to have a very nasty, unpleasant time with their country turned into a third world state, a third world condition as a result of the collapse of their economy. And they elected the communists. They were let down by them, but that's another story. But they elected the communists in desperation. They moved away from the mainstream. And the new communist government appointed Yanis Varoufakis, an economist, left-wing economist, as the finance minister. And he went off to the first meeting of the European finance ministers, and he said to Wolfgang Schäuble, he's the chap in the wheelchair who was somebody who tried to assassinate. Yeah, he was the finance minister for Germany, and I think he's now the president of the Bundestag. And he said to Schäuble, well, we've had an election in our country, and we voted not to be turned into a third world society by austerity. And Schäuble said a very interesting thing. He said, well, economics can't be allowed to stand elections cannot be allowed to stand in the way of economics. Now, you might think, well, okay, that's the sort of thing a European politician would say, one who's dedicated to a single European state. They're not really much concerned about what local people think, what local electorates might think. So, but it actually goes a lot. It's actually a much bigger statement, which you probably wouldn't want to make publicly. You can say, well, economics may thwart the electorate in their wishes, but to say, oh, we're not going to allow economics to be withstood by any electorate. That's a pretty striking statement. I mean, it's actually a totalitarian statement, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I want to trace that because it actually raises huge ramifications about what sort of society we live in here. Because even though people may never heard of the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, all of us were brought up in the tradition which arose from the principles agreed in 1648. When the 30 Years' War ended, the princes in Europe had all been fighting one another. They destroyed half of Europe, and they came to an agreement. From now on, we're going to respect each other's sovereignty, small or large. The sovereignty of states would be respected. Only the state would be allowed to have armed forces, because everybody knows in the Middle Ages the barons would get up an army and attack the king. And the third principle was that you should have a balance of power between the various forces. So we grew up on these things without really thinking about them. Why did we go to war in Poland? Okay, war over Poland in 1989. Well, nominally at least it was because Polish sovereignty had been infringed, yeah? So we all grew up on these ideas without thinking about it much. It's been bred into our system over hundreds of years. And what Chauvelin was actually saying is, well, Westphalia doesn't count anymore. We're going to dispose of all that. Actually, Tony Blair said something of the same thing just after he was elected Prime Minister. He said at a conference, 1999 I think, he said at a conference that the Westphalian system was out of date and we needed something more international. In other words, we're going to dispose of the sovereignty of states. The people in those states who thought they had some rights within their state aren't going to have any anymore. And so it was a very striking thing by it, and Varoufakis drew attention to this and how striking it was. He's mentioned often in his speeches. So Westphalia is to be overthrown. And what is this really all about? What is a world war? A world war is simply a lot of people getting together in various ways and trying to get more power over other people, isn't it? Usually it's done by military force because that's the only way you're going to do it. But that's not necessarily the case. There are other means of military force to conduct a war and get power. Anything that obtains power for a very large, for a small sect over most of the world, which is what they're hoping to do, could be called a war. And that's why I'm going to describe what's happening as a world war. Now, 1989, communism collapsed, and that was really the end of the Second World War. That was really the end of a prolonged war which started in 1918. It's worth just tracing this idea because it puts things more in perspective. 1918, a world war started. When 1914, the world war started. Yeah. In 1918, a French general famously said that this wasn't actually the end of the war. It was only a temporary truce. He was bloody right there, wasn't he? It all started again in 1939. And in fact, at the beginning of the Second World War, Alan Brooke, who actually ran the war in this country for most of the duration, said he was surprised to find himself in France in the same hotel in the same town he'd been in during the First World War. I mean, it was just the same, a continuance of the same thing. And then 1945, we had another apparent end of the war, but it didn't really end because the Cold War started. And there was a Cold War which almost became hot from time to time. Remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? That was terrifying. We really thought we were all going to be dead within a day or two, and it was quite likely we could have been. So the war really only lasted from 1918 to 1989 when the communist system collapsed. And at that point there was a bit of a wave of euphoria, a sort of Western spring, if you like, that the conflict was over, and Francis Fukuyama became an international celebrity on the lecture circuit and book circuit with his book, The End of History. And what he said was that the collapse of communism means that the old battles about how the world should be run and what sort of governmental systems you'd have had come to an end. And everybody would now accept liberal representative democracy. Well, he was a bit premature there, wasn't he? I mean, apart from anything else, the big flaw in this argument is you can have any nominal system you like. Liberal representative democracy might be the best system, but all these systems, whatever nominal system you have, can be corrupted and perverted from inside, so it doesn't actually amount to what it pretends to be. I mean, we pretend to have a democracy in this country, but there's actually very little democracy, even though we have elections. So, but Fukuyama he just caught the mood of the times, that this was a huge springtime for humanity, and history had come to an end, and we'd all settled down into liberal representative democracy in peace. Well, Fukuyama now says, well, he actually got it wrong because of identity politics. Well, no, it wasn't that. No, there's a bit of that in it. But the real reason history hasn't come to an end because another war started. In 1989, little perceived, but perceived by people who are looking for power, the opportunities that peace with the communists brought about, international trade, international movement, the growth of the web, which enabled businesses to operate internationally. This offered an opportunity for a new empire to be formed based on international business, which would have unprecedented power, far greater than anything the British Empire could ever have dreamed of. Because it also, I mean, the British Empire controlled other countries, but it didn't attempt to actually subvert the local life of people there in the way that the present system is doing. The British Raj didn't attempt to replace the population of India. They're actually, in the Raj, how did the British run India? There were only a few thousand civil servants who ran the whole place. The army was mostly composed of locals. Very few Europeans in India ran India. So these were not. This was an empire where the peoples could leave at any time and pick up where they went off. It didn't subvert their whole existences in the way that the current world war is attempting to do. History hasn't ended. Well, it's never going to end because of human nature. But quite a lot here, so I'm going to get on with it. Now, the unnoticed, another war began in 1989. As always, people are seeking more power and money, saw an opportunity in it, and they're now making an attempt at what is really world conquest. I mean, the objective really is world government, isn't it? Which they claim will be benign. It won't be, of course, but they'll claim it's benign. I mean, the people who run these sort of things, the big movers and shakers internationally, they wouldn't see themselves as bad people. They honestly believe they're bringing a sort of more logical and rational and fair system to the world with more opportunity for people. They're not there, but of course it's very easy to convince yourself. When you get huge privileges out of what you're doing and money, it's very easy to convince yourself it's also in the interest of the public. I mean, you get that in charities too, the same thing. People in charities convince themselves they're actually doing more good than they're really doing. It's only human nature. It's only human nature. So how are they going about this since 1989? The globalists, what are they really doing? Well, they're actually fighting what's been, partially at least, what's been called fourth generation warfare. So I want to outline that because you can get it in perspective more. This is a theory that came about in the 1980s, 4 generations of warfare, from William Lind. And the idea is the first generation of warfare was like the Romans, state armies. They fought in a line, formed up in a line, opposite the line of the other side, and they all fought one another. And they wore uniforms to identify themselves, had officers. That's the first generation of warfare. The second came along when artillery and guns were invented. It became very costly to fight in a line and attack people. And so we started having artillery barrages, to soften the other side up. That's second generation warfare. For instance, the artillery barrage, which was designed to make it easy for the infantry to advance to the Battle of the Somme, it was such a big artillery barrage, you could hear it on Hampstead Heath. Isn't that astonishing? Yeah. I mean, so that was second generation warfare. Then people began to realise, well, you get stalemated with second generation warfare, as they did with trenches and artillery. So the idea that Germans developed, which appeared in the Second World War, was lightning fast movements, so you get round people before they can actually resist. Instead of forming up on a field and saying, here we are, and the other side says, here we are, and then somebody waves the flag and they all start fighting. The idea, you didn't wait for all that, you just went round the back and flanked them, outwitted them, and the Germans did that very effectively at the beginning of World War II. It was a much more flexible, fast-moving type of tactical war. And that's the third world, that's the third type of, the third generation war. The fourth generation is what's grown up since World War II, when it was realised by people who want to resist power, or obtain it, that actually you can go a long way with very little actual force if you use other methods. Psychological, legal, political, and anything you can think of. You may actually be able to, in some circumstances, do away with the military side entirely, the violent side, and just have a psychological war and take over the world by psychological pressure and persuasion. That's not impossible. You could do that with the aid of the media, provided human nature has stood it for long enough. So fourth generation war, the Taliban, the IRA, lots of different methods were used, and the military side is not even necessarily the most important one. And what the globalists have been doing since 1989, they've been fighting a fourth generation war in which they've used legal means. They use legal means all the time, like the attempt to stop Britain leaving through the courts to stop Britain leaving the European Union. Use the courts to stop people expelling violent immigrants on the grounds that their human rights would be infringed. So there's lots of ways of impinging international power through legal means. You can do it through psychological means, through simply telling people if you don't agree with us, you're a bad person who hates humanity, something like that. You can do it politically by paying off or recruiting local politicians, make it not worthwhile for them to resist. And for example, no mainstream politician in this country will really stick up for Britain anymore, because as soon as they do, the press will come down on them, and they'll be accused of being racist and so on. It's not worth their while career-wise to actually stick up for Britain. And some years ago, Jonathan Bowden remarked at a meeting that even Churchill's grandson, Winston Churchill, couldn't speak out quite moderately against immigration. Immediately he did. He died not long afterwards, yeah?
He was thrown out,
yeah, he was thrown out. He was more or less squeezed out. And he was if Churchill's grandson can't speak, who the hell can? So globalism has managed to subvert our politicians, subverted the law. These means are intensive and continuous. They go on for long periods. Every day you're exposed to these pressure from the global war, which doesn't take a military, any kind of military form, although there's a little bit of military in it. What military methods do the globalists use to forward their agenda, to forward their war? Well, inside Western countries, they don't use much violence, but they use a bit. One way this has been done is by proxy. Rather than the IRA having their own fighters who let off bombs, you let in people who are going to let off bombs for you. Isn't it mysterious that people can come to this country who want to blow us up in such large numbers that security services say there are too many to watch? Well, why don't you let them in the first place? You've created a situation where you're guaranteed to have terrorism. And that's what they've done. So the globalists have created, actually, by pressure, human rights, calling it human rights. Yeah. They've actually created a situation where other people will do a little bit of violence for them. And the second strand in their method of using violence is to use left-wing groups, who, of course, use a certain amount of violence, a lot of intimidation, threats and intimidation. Great mystery they are, the left, because most of the people in these things, the actual foot soldiers, seem to honestly believe they're bringing about some kind of socialist utopia. What they're really working for is global, really rich, powerful global people who want to turn the rest of us into drones working for them. They wouldn't see it that way, but that's what they're actually doing. Yeah. Now, is there? So people say, well, where? Is this crazy? What are you talking about? This global war? Who's conducting this war? Is there a group of people sitting around a table, all cackling and plotting? Oh, this is what we're going to do. No, you don't need that. One of the great insights of Austrian economics is if a lot of people have a common objective, by all their wheeling and dealing together, they'll produce an outcome in what they do in a concerted way, which actually looks like it's something that's been plotted by people around a table. But it's not. It's a sort of unseen hand that draws people to act together and make them look as though they're concerted. And one of the beauties of the conducting of the World War since 1989 is that it doesn't involve an identifiable country. You can say, well, they're the enemy, they're making war on us. It doesn't involve an identifiable dictator, say. There's no individual you can look to or country and say, well, this is where the threat is coming from. It's amorphous, it's spread, it's disaggregated, it's all over the world, So you can't quite get to terms with what's going on, but something's going on. There's a concerted action to remove your society from you. The fourth people who've conducted fourth type of wars have found how effective it can be, how effective you can combat huge states with huge conventional armed forces by using these sort of tactical methods like the law, propaganda and small-scale violence. The objective isn't to defeat the big states and their armies, even if you wanted to, which they don't want to do, they want to take them over. But the objective isn't to defeat, it's to make it seem not worthwhile to resist anymore. That was the objective of the IRA. Wear you down until really this isn't worth it anymore, let's just give up. That's how they work. And this can take a very long time, but they don't mind waiting. And the globalists will wait a century. I mean, Juncker said, in a century, I know how to create a much better society in a century's time. So that's their thinking. How can we do? EU, of course, is a stage on the way to a world government. You start with the EU, and then they'd like to bring in some African states, move into the more eastern states, gradually create a world system, maybe join up with another world system. So all this is on the way to world government by an elite who, in fact, would enjoy privilege and power unseen by any empire in the history of the world. Yeah, you control the whole world and control psychology, and the peoples have been subverted internally by immigration. It's unprecedented. I mean, this is the sort of thing Blair would have liked. I mean, I always think of Blair. He wanted to be the president of Europe, and I just always imagine him travelling around on a sort of special train, you know, the sort of emperor, you know, travelling around in state. Well, he didn't get it, of course, but he didn't get it. But that's what he wanted. That's what people like this want, and the top politicians are not there to do things in a sense. They're there to be something, to get to be the top dog. I mean, what's May interested in doing in this country? Nothing in particular. She just likes being top dog, doesn't she? You know, they're all like it. So, but politicians are easily subverted to people who do want to do things like get more money and power. Yeah, they become puppets. When Britain took over India, there were two principal means they used to keep control. Was first having a British Indian army, most of whom were Indians. Yeah, so you didn't have to provide the manpower. And the second thing was they kept the Maharajas. They said, okay, you can keep your position, your money and your palaces, and this reassured the local population that we've still got our Maharajas. And I would regard May as a sort of one of the Indian Maharajas. You know, she's not. You can keep your position in Downing Street and your motorcade and so on. You know, as long as you just go along with what people in real power want. And Aaron Bevan actually famously said that as he moved up the political ladder, he was always looking to see where. He always thought the next stage up he'd have real power, and he kept finding out when he got to the next ladder it was always a level up. You could never actually quite get to the point where you had real power. I thought it was a very interesting comment made in the 1940s. Yeah, so power tends to be higher up. So looking again at this idea of fourth generation war, I mean von Clausewitz, a military theorist, often quoted, famously said that war is a method of doing politics and statesmanship by other means. Well, actually, fourth generation war that uses very little violence is actually war by other means. Yeah, you don't need the big army anymore and the big artillery. A little bit of violence because it keeps people's popular heads down, makes people know you're serious. But much of it can be done by other means. So this is a form of warfare that surpasses warfare, but achieves things that you probably couldn't do by conventional warfare. If any state now set up and said we're going to invade the whole world with our armed forces and take it over, there'd be resistance. When it's all decentralised and spread around between different factions around the world, you have a common enterprise, without necessarily agreeing with each other entirely, it's much more difficult to resist and much more difficult to understand, which is why the person in the street doesn't really understand there's a war going on, because he's always thought that the person in the street's always thought in, without knowing it, in Westphalian terms. What does a war mean? Well, it means another state. They've got an army. Only under the Westphalian system, only states can have armies. So a war means another state has an army, and it sends their army against yours. This goes round the back. This is if you like, the the fourth generation equivalent of what the Germans did during World War II, which is to go round the back, fast war of movement. You never really know quite where you are. So it's quite now the very interesting thing here. Who pioneered this idea of fourth generation warfare? Well, actually, in a way, the communists did. Because when World War I ended, the communists had high hopes of revolution in the big industrial states. Yeah, and it didn't work. They didn't happen. You know, they had high hopes of it. They wanted the big industrial states, the proletariats, to rise up. There was a revolt in Berlin, and Rosa Luxemburg ended up being murdered and thrown in the canal. It didn't work. And the big tragedy of Lenin's life was he ended up in Russia. He didn't want to be the head of Russia, he wanted to be the head of some big industrial states under a communist regime. He ended up in this agrarian backwater with a tiny proletariat. From Lenin's point of view, it was a huge personal tragedy. And so then during the 1920s, the communists started thinking, well, are there other ways of doing this? We've tried the street, bringing about revolution by power on the street. Didn't really get us far in the industrial countries. Is there another way of doing things? And they came up with the idea of Frankfurt School Marxism, but the idea of subverting the system from the inside by various means, subverting its culture, attacking its values, and they've been supremely effective at this. I mean, even the Tories now are even the Tories now do what the Frankfurt School Marxists want, like destroying gender. You know, let's destroy gender. And anything that people rely on to give them a sort of an idea of what's going on in the world and give them some framework to understand it. Let's destroy all this stuff. They've been terribly effective at it, and the communists actually pioneered this. So you can see why other people probably started thinking about this and thought, well, we can use these methods too. You know, anybody can use these methods. So the Third World War is now in its 30th year. Set piece armies are useless against it because it's not fought that way. I mean, people complain about the decline of the British Army, but I mean, if we had a bigger British Army, what would it do? You know, the British Army, some squaddies in a camp, you know, with rifles, can't fight an international system of propaganda. They're not hired to do that kind of thing. So the reduction in numbers of the British Army in the current struggle really doesn't matter at all because they're not relevant. Why do people think they're relevant? Because people are still thinking of Westphalian terms of the threat from other countries coming for an army sent by a state. We're also, particularly in the wake of the Second World War, we're also steeped in this kind of thinking that we can't quite, people find it very difficult to think outside the box of where power is and how it can be obtained. And it's not necessarily through an army marching into your country. Politicians like May are Maharaja, but the politicians have become sort of just frontmen. They're sort of PR frontmen, aren't they, for the real power and the economic and political impulses worldwide. And they talk like it. They're not even convincing anymore. They all seem to use the same phrases that have been taught on some media course. They obviously all go on media training courses.
Common purpose, that's where...
Well, common purpose, but there are lots of media training courses apart from common purpose, where people learn how to handle interviews, how to not put your foot in it, and they all learn these stock phrases that they trot out. It's a bit like the police saying, "I'm only doing my job." It's the all-purpose thing. They learn it off a computer. If you have any problem, you just say, "Well, I'm only doing my job," you know, and that kills all discussion. And politicians, they're all using these expressions. Here's three of them they use all the time. The right thing to do. You heard that one?
Yeah.
Oh, the right thing. Well, the right thing to do. This is the right thing to do. We're going to do it. It means we're doing what suits us, you know. Not the right thing. We're doing what suits us. That's what they mean by that. And then there's another one they use. I have been clear about the position. That means they're lying. They say they're clear about. They say I've been clear about something. You can be sure they haven't been clear. And then the other one I love is, I think we can rely on the common sense of the British people. What that means is, if you don't agree with us, you're stupid. You're stupid, you know. Now I'm a conservative, but with a small c, And why am I conservative? Because I recognise that any plan for utopia is going to fail, because all utopias make too great demands on human nature. And I said there was a communist in the 1990s after the fall of the war. The communist in my area was a nice chap. I said to him, "What do you think about communism now?" And he said, "Well, it made too great demands on human nature." We simply can't construct. Human beings can't construct utopias. Or some of them still. In fact, Yanis Varoufakis, he's a leftist. He's a radical leftist. He said that, in a very frank moment, he said this. He said, "We radicals of the left have been a disaster. We caused the Gulag." So, but he said, "But there's nothing wrong in us trying again and trying to get it right next time." Well, good luck with that, you know. I mean, this just won't work. This has been the mania for the last since the beginning of the last century. This mania for constructing utopias which can't be constructed. And some people thinking, "Oh, well, maybe we'll do it right next time." That's not the way to arrive at a better society. That's why I'm a small c conservative. You can't do this. It's doomed to falter. And no one, I've never come across anybody, we're dealing with human beings, with these funny creatures who are curious creatures who are sort of halfway between men and gods and beasts. We're all, humankind is halfway between God and beast, isn't it? Yeah, we've got our animal side, and then we've got these huge, very clever brains. And of course, the people who become powerful in the world, they're often very clever people, very intelligent. But very intelligent, superficially intelligent IQ, but it doesn't mean they've got much in the way of insight. And somebody was telling me last night that she said to somebody that about the removal of Saddam Hussein, it wasn't such a good idea. And this guy said, well, he was a dictator, so it was a good idea to get rid of him. Now this guy had a PhD. Yeah, this is a guy with a PhD, but he can't think more than one step ahead. Dictator, bad thing, let's remove him. He couldn't think 2 steps ahead. Well, what happens afterwards, you know? He can't think ahead, you know. Just don't have that kind of mindset to work your way around the intuitive difficulties of the problem. And human beings are fraught with these sort of psychological difficulties of making sense of things and keeping their brains on board and not falling back into a mixture of being God or beast. And nobody's ever described this that I've come across better than Alexander Pope, the Twickenham poet, 2 centuries ago. And this is what he said about being stuck between God and beast. Placed on this isthmus of a middle state, a being darkly wise and rudely great, in doubt to deem himself a god or beast, born but to die, and reasoning but to err, alike in ignorance, whether he thinks too little or too much, created half to rise and half to fall, great lord of all things, yet a prey to all, sole judge of truth in endless error hurled, the glory, jest and riddle of the world.
Riddle of the world,
yeah. I mean, I've never heard anybody describe the condition of human beings better than Pope did. So no wonder we're in a mess when the raw material we deal with in trying to run the world and run society is this funny mixture. Yeah, and beware of people who think they've come up with some utopian scheme. We're now in the 30th year of World War III. Of course, the Westphalian peace came after the famous 30 Years' War. Yeah. But that one ended after 30 years. This one shows no sign of abating yet. But it's certainly true that people are beginning to perceive the realities of what's going on. That this is a destruction of our societies. You hear that more and more, don't you? Yeah. So this is beginning to impinge on people. But we as radicals have to try and put things in a way that they become comprehensible to people. And people in radical groups, they're caught up in their own little world. They talk often, you come along to some radical group and they're talking their own language. They're not talking to the public. They talk in their own language, they only talk to themselves. They find it difficult to communicate with people outsiders who don't really understand what they're saying. And we have to reach out to people, and if we can't do it, somebody else has to. And of course people are beginning to do that. We haven't been. The nationalist movement has not been good communicators. We've often alienated people when we didn't need to. I mean, half of the art of advocacy is to put across your points without alienating people. So they say, well, I don't hate you, but I may disagree with what you say, but yeah, I can see what you're aiming at here. You know, you remember, we set out often to alienate people. We didn't need to do that. So we have to think far harder of how to communicate people in a way that will reach out to people who aren't political obsessives and don't wake up in the morning and start reading all the newspapers, thinking about what's going on. But we're working with difficult material here. It's like trying to work with pieces of wood and put things together when the wood's got lots of knots in it. Anyone who's ever tried to do that, it's difficult to plane, it's difficult to sand, you know, it's difficult to work with, the joints break. And that's the sort of material, that's the sort of wood, timber that we're working with in trying to construct a reasonable society. But we have to aim at doing better.
Anyone got any questions for Michael? Please to hear, and then
a war with Iran, which we might get sucked into, is a possibility, you think?
I don't know. I mean, nobody knows because nobody tells us what the thinking is behind the scenes of the people who are making policy. You may only learn about it many, many years later. I mean, people are still arguing about the First World War. Did the Germans intend to have a war, or was it an accident? They're still arguing about that a century later. You know, it's very difficult to work out what people's motives are in these things because they don't tell you the truth. They don't reveal it. People say misleading things. Yeah, it's very difficult.
This gentleman here was next.
You said the Frankfurt School was a successful way of promoting communism without revolution.
Yes.
Yeah, you know, step by
Yeah.
step. There's a left-wing society who did that as well, isn't there?
Does
A left-wing society in the 30s as well. What was it? Fairness, I think.
Well, the Frankfurt School was a left-wing.
Yes, yeah.
It's a communist movement. Yeah.
My question is, do you think that the current heavy political correctness actually started with the Frankfurt School?
Yes, that was one of their tactics. Yeah. Yeah.
So all this stuff about gender and race.
Yeah, that's all part. That's all part of it. It's to undermine the values of the society so it collapses, falls into your hands without needing force on the street. It's been very effective, hasn't it?
Sam, you want to?
You referred to Alexander Pope.
Yeah.
One of his most famous sayings, I suppose, is a little learning is a dangerous thing.
Yeah.
How relevant do you think that has been in the conduct of hostilities and the way people react to hostilities down the ages?
Most people don't have any choice in the matter, do they? In reacting to hostilities, they're told by the government, this is the situation and this is what we're going to do, and you go along with it. I mean, they don't have much choice in the matter.
Julian. And then, was that you, Fred? Julian, wasn't it? Oh, sorry, I thought it was Julian's hand up. Not you again, Eddie. No, go on.
The Fukuyama's end of history is sort of been true because it led to the global economy, didn't it? The collapse of the Iron Curtain led to the global economy.
Oh, well, he wasn't talking. Yeah, but what he was talking about was that people would accept a particular form of government as the final end of the debate on how society should be governed.
Yes.
Yeah.
But also on that aspect, I was going to say something else, but on that aspect, in a way, what we're seeing in the Middle East is the Western hegemonic powers trying to impose that on the Middle East, and that's sort of what Arab Spring was about, isn't it? But anyway, on the global economy, you're quite right, the battlefield has totally changed. When I got involved, when Chris got involved, there were nation states. Britain was a nation, although we were in the EEC then, there were obvious nation states, we had industries, there were national industries. Now they're global industries. And the big companies now, which are all global, like Amazon or Apple or Microsoft or Google or Facebook, they're the most biggest brands in the world in terms of revenue. They can control communications as never before in our life. And they're the actual enemy, not countries. Those big brands, they don't care about us as a country because we're consumers. They don't care as us as English people.
No,
They don't care
exactly.
English people live in what is called Britain. They just care about consumers who live in the geographical area.
Yeah, well, the fourth generation warfare is partly psychological. A big chunk of it's psychological. So if if increasing numbers of people in Britain work for international companies, they're actually the servants of this international system. They're not the servants of this country anymore. This affects the way they think. And of course, they're propagandised continuously that this international system is bringing them wonderful job at Amazon, having been pushed around to pick up 50 parcels in an hour or something,
Or if they go, it threatens their livelihood.
Yeah, or their livelihood. If you don't support try working in any kind of big company, international company now, and saying that you think diversity is a means of eradicating the British people. You won't get far in your job doing that, will you? It's like going to the Bank of England and for a job and saying, well, actually, I don't think there should be central banks. I don't think it's a good idea. There are good arguments for not having central banks. You're not going to get a job there, are you?
Most big companies like that now have online questions that are mandatory for staff to take on diversity. They're pumping it down your throat.
They're pumping it down your throat. The British in India employed most of the work running and keeping in power was done by locals who were employed. You've taken it a stage further now. You've got far more people working for the international power and under far greater psychological pressure to conform to what their objectives are.
The difference is, when we had the empire, we took people like Gandhi here to go to university, but we deliberately didn't try and brainwash him into being a good British subject. We wanted them to express themselves and all this sort of stuff. Said go and try and turf us out, and we got back. We actually ran it completely.
Well, brainwash. The biggest weapon in the hands of the war makers in this Third World War is psychological. It's psychological warfare. In fact, it's largely replaced the need for violence. If people are propagandised in their workplace about supporting the international power, you don't need to worry about them wanting to join the army and shoot against any invaders, do you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I quickly come back on one thing, very quickly? If General MacArthur had his way back in December 1950, and on the defeat of North Korea, he wanted to invade the Chinese mainland.
Yeah.
Would you identify that as almost a certain instance of the outbreak of a Third World War?
Yes, it probably would have been, yeah. Well, he got removed, didn't he?
Well, I think we would have all been annihilated.
Yeah, we probably would have been, yeah.
50, they didn't have the bomb then, did they?
Well, I think we can be a bit in a way, we can be a bit thankful that the Third World War is being conducted by the means it is. At least we're not being on a large scale killed, blown up, inducted into armies and shot, are we? So we'd be
We're just being genocided
we're
by
being
mass
no.
immigration.
Yes, we're being genocided by dilution.
Sorry, Peter wanted to comment.
Quite agree.
Is there still, Mike, some reason for optimism
Yes.
in the face of these apparently all-powerful international corporations?
Yes, because
Thinking, for example, not so many years ago, only 20, 30 years ago, that people thought that what this red barrel was going to take over the world, there was not going to be no place for rebel.
Yeah.
It didn't work out that way, did it?
No, it didn't.
People deep down want some sort of authenticity. And similarly, British people deep down still want to be British,
Yes.
not just global citizens.
That's right. When communism collapsed in Russia, I remember there was a BBC broadcast from Moscow, and this reporter said, when the BBC was a little more better than it is now, reporter said, an older Russia, which people thought had ceased to exist, suddenly emerged again. It just bubbled up and appeared again, like it never disappeared. So people. As Pope said, people are cussed. People are poised between man and beast. They're not that easy to manipulate in the long run. Yeah. They get cussed about it, and people are beginning to become cussed. And you can see that all over Europe, can't you? People are getting very cussed towards this system, increasingly aggravated. And it's only in this country that we haven't got any large resistance movement, which is a little curious, but who knows what will happen. The point is, as long as things change in other countries, that will also influence the thinking of people here, because people are herd animals. If all the countries Europe started saying, we're fed up with the global system, we're fed up with the EU, people will fall in line here. They're like that. Yep. So yes, there's plenty of reasons. They won't win. They're not going to get a world government run by an elite, the likes of Blair. This is not going to happen. But there can be a lot of misery along the way while it continues to force its way forward and then falls flat.
Yeah, cheers. I want to thank Mike. I thought it was a very insightful.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for coming. The collect-